Welcome, everybody, to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. I'm Peter Geoghegan, Open Democracy's Editor-in-Chief, and I'm really pleased to be here with this very, very timely discussion topic on corruption and the narrative of corruption. And I should say that we do often plan our weekly discussions a little bit in advance, but I could never have imagined that this would be quite so prescient as it is this week. And we want to involve you as much as possible in this conversation. So huge thanks in particular to all of you who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to try and address as many of those as we can as we can during the talk. And if you're joining us on Zoom and if you have any questions or comments for us, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. And people watching on Facebook can put their questions in the comments. And so today's topic, as I mentioned, is how to change the narrative on corruption in the United Kingdom. And I'm really pleased to be here with an absolutely stellar panel. We have Sue Hawley, who's the Executive Director of Spotlight on Corruption, Oliver Bullough, who's a journalist and the author of Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back, and Prem Sikka, who's a member of the House of Lords and an Emeritus Professor of Accounting at the Essex Business School at the University of Essex and at the Sheffield University Management School. So thank you very much for everyone who's joined us. And it feels like the place to start this conversation today really is in British politics and Westminster politics. We've had an incredible couple of weeks. Last week, about this time last week, the government had just done a U-turn, having tried to abolish its own standards committee in an attempt to prevent former cabinet minister Owen Paterson, who'd been found guilty of lobbying, had been found to have broken the parliamentary rules by lobbying, to try and stop him being suspended for 30 days from the House of Commons. Owen Paterson is now gone. He's now stood down as an MP, but the scandal and the questions around corruption in British politics, if anything, have got even greater. At the weekend, I think open democracy is an issue we've been trying to shine a light on these issues for a very long time. I'd like to think that the weekend we probably played a bit of a part in this story by revealing with the Sunday Times that if you're a Conservative treasurer and if you give £3 million as a donation to the Tory party, there's a very, 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 very good chance you'll end up in the House of Lords. And just to let you know, Prem Sikka has not given, as far as I'm aware, £3 million to the Tory party, just before anybody asks that question. But really, this has been a week in which we've seen a huge amount of I think the stench of sleaze and corruption in British politics has become so overpowering that it's risen to the very top of the news agenda. And apologies for that tortured metaphor. And yesterday, Boris Johnson was asked, is Britain a corrupt country? And he's completely said, and of course it's not, and denied it. But when I heard that question being asked at COP, I was really struck by a comment that Roberto Saviano made back in 2016, in which he said that Britain was the most corrupt country in the world because of its role as a facilitator of global corruption. And I think I wanted today just to start by, we'll probably go on to some of those points later on the talk, but I want to start by asking each of the panel to answer that question that Boris Johnson was asked. Is Britain a corrupt country? Oliver, what do you think?
Corruption is like an irregular noun. It's something that your enemies do. So in Britain we have cronyism, or cash for questions, or we might have the establishment or the old school tie, but we don't have corruption. That's far too vulgar for a country like this. But really, if you look at the situation from Roberto Saviano's perspective, he's the great writer on the mafia in Italy, which I think makes him the great writer on the mafia worldwide. If you look at the role that the UK plays in moving money for the mafia, or obviously for the cartels from South America, or the various kleptocrats from Central Asia, Russia, Africa, and so on, then Britain is certainly the leading provider of corruption services. We might not be a place where policemen take bribes on the street, but we are corrupt in the same way that Switzerland was corrupt when it took Nazi gold. It's a form of corruption that stands behind all the other corruption. We are the fences to other people's thieves. And I think, to be honest, the fact that we define corruption as something other than what we are is part of the problem. We need to recognize that without what the UK does, in accepting this money, in laundering the reputations of the people who steal money, in structuring their companies and raising capital for their companies and so on, that we are complicit. Without us, they couldn't be as corrupt as they are. And that means, yes, we are corrupt. And I think it's kind of shameful that Boris Johnson didn't recognise that, to be honest.
Sue, what's your take on this from Spotlight Corruption?
So I think the narrative this week has shifted. And I think Oliver's point, and he's done absolutely amazing work on this, about how the UK is an enabler and that not being recognised as a form of corruption is really important. I also think that this week we kind of moved from being an enabler to a perpetrator in a way, and it was kind of corruption came home to roost. And I think when you have people like Lord Evans, a former spy master, who's now the ethics commissioner, saying we're sliding into corruption, serious risk, where we got, Sir John Major, saying this is a form of political corruption going on. As Oliver said, we've used euphemisms up to now, and now people are actually finally talking about, corruption. So, actually for me, it's been a really exciting week, because we have gone from an incredible low last week, incredible, where you thought, how could this happen in a democratic country, that government could abuse its majority like this to railroad out independent standards regulators, to one where we're talking about whether MPs should have second jobs and what their outside interests should be. And I think it's that actually is a real testament to the incredible independent media in this country, like openDemocracy, actually like the Daily Mail, that has played an extraordinary role in this, and is probably to credit for some of the U-turn. But I just wanted to sound a quick word of caution, which is what, I have a bit of concern about. I think the independent media and independent bodies, really exposing corruption is amazing. I worry about the politicization of corruption as an anti-Tory battering ram. And I'll tell you why. I just think that when that happens, all politicians get tarred by the same brush, and that you kind of can foster even more cynicism. And first of all, corruption can't be a kind of replacement for a proper policy agenda, for opposition parties. But I think it's also, we've got to remember the people behind, this, who are paying MPs, to represent their interests. And they'll do that because it's the party in government. And, we all remember Jeff Hoon and Steve Byers being caught in a sting operation, offering their services for money. So I think that's where, real plug here for independent standards regulation as the way, and this is a real opportunity for reform, and we need to find a way to get a kind of cross-party momentum behind it.
Thank you very much, Sue. Prem, how do you feel about this question? This question, is Britain a corrupt country?
I think I will make a slight distinction here. When we talk about a country, we are referring to the people. A vast majority of people in this country are not corrupt, but what we do have is institutions which are corrupt. Whether they are political, financial, regulatory, judicial, we can talk about all of them. At the political level, some of the problems have already been referred, but the big question we're going to ask ourselves is, the behavior we are referring to is not natural. Nobody is born to be, as it were, corrupt or seek private advantage by subverting, if you like, public choices or the welfare of the public. That behavior is learned. How is it actually learned? Because if we're going to introduce reforms, presumably we have to reflect on the way our culture is. Our culture suggests it is okay to bribe someone to get to the top of the tree. It is okay to pocket money if you're a member of parliament. As long as nobody knows, you can pocket the money and do the bidding of your clients. So there is a whole issue here about the culture. What is wrong with our culture? I'm not saying that other cultures are pristine, but it is particularly a problem in Britain and has been for a long time. And I think really, often I hear in Parliament, people talk about, we have the best democracy that money can buy. The irony is that money has actually bought it. And it is ordinary people who are really excluded. So we really need fundamental reforms at every level. And perhaps I'll be able to explain a little bit more later on. Thank
you very much, Prem. I kind of wanted just to come back to the title of this talk, changing the narrative on corruption. And, you know, in some ways that narrative has changed, like as Sue mentioned, over the last week. We've seen, you know, stories about MPs' second jobs on the front page of the Daily Mail, which really has changed, I think, the conversation we're having. But more generally, it does feel like there is a narrative change about how we understand corruption in British public life and Britain's role in facilitating corruption internationally. You know, Oliver, someone who's written a lot about this, you know, and I know from our conversations, narrative is something really important to you. Like, how do we start to do that? What would a change of narrative look like?
I mean, I think we need to recognise that corruption is not victimless. You know, a lot of the post-war success of the City of London, let's be honest, is based on undercutting Wall Street, on offering offshore services, which, you know, if they were too dodgy for the City of London, they could be routed via the British Virgin Islands or Jersey or Gibraltar or Cayman or so on. But essentially, this is all part of the same, you know, British offshore game. And, you know, that offshoring, you know, the suffering, but bringing the profits home is what Britain has been doing for a long time. I don't think that's really disputed by anyone who's looked at the situation. I mean, I think what's been interesting this week, as Sue was saying, is that, you know, we now have a perception that actually there are British politicians who are themselves on the take in a way that, you know, something that we thought previously largely happened overseas. And perhaps that will help to change the perception in the UK that the damage is happening here at home. You know, I would say the headlines of about Geoffrey Cox and the British Virgin Islands, and like you say, fair play to the Daily Mail. When the Daily Mail goes for a story, it really goes for a story. I mean, that was like a hand grenade. You know, the headlines about Geoffrey Cox, that, you know, this is supposedly a member of Parliament who is representing his constituents from the British Virgin Islands while defending the Premier of the British Virgin Islands or the government of the BVI in a corruption investigation. I mean, it couldn't be more stark that something has gone very awry with his moral compass, and therefore more broadly the moral compass of our representatives. So I'm hoping that this is, you know, a moment when the narrative changes by itself. I mean, I think we can probably all remember the phone hacking stories when, you know, the Guardian plugged away at phone hacking for ages. It was when they revealed that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked that suddenly everything changed. And I feel that this week, initially with Owen Paterson, but then more seriously with Geoffrey Cox, that's, I would say, the Millie Dowler moment. And so I think that maybe the narrative is changing, and, you know, that is, you know, very, very hopeful, because like you say, banging our heads against this wall for a long time has been very difficult and very frustrating, and it does seem that, you know, we haven't really been getting anywhere.
So I actually just want to pick up, there's a point there James Bolton Jones has made in the chat there. He's asking, like, could you expand on what practical steps could be taken to build momentum to curb political corruption on a cross-party basis? And that feels like something that kind of almost keys in with this idea of a narrative and how we think about these things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the key thing is that, as Lord Evans said about the MP scandal, is that the solutions are all out there, actually. You know, he said on the Today programme this morning, you know, they made a report back in 2018 about MPs outside jobs. The trouble with that is the CSPL, who are really quite eminent, you know, panel of people. They do these great consultations. They come up with really thorough work, often very, very quite conservative, to try and get it on the agenda. So they're not like radicals, and they sit gathering dust on the shelf. And I think for me, that's the question, is like, you know, can we turn this? It feels like there's been a lot of this terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. And it is really important to give hope. Like, you know, actually, this is about what kind of country we want to be, what kind of institutions we want to have. And so, you know, I think it's is a moment for saying, well, come on, you know, bottom line, really minimum, just implement the recommendations that the Committee on Standards in Public Life have put on the table, and make it really embarrassing for the government for not doing that. I mean, they've got their own Boardman report, and like, I know there was lots of criticism about Boardman's report because it was a little bit, let's let the ministers off the hook and focus on the civil servants, but he said something actually kind of borderline revolutionary in there, which is that there's unequal access to decision makers in the UK, and it has to be made equal. And I think bringing back that notion that politicians have to be general neutral arbiters and not allowed to be captured by private interests is really important. So I think we start with, we don't have to invent solutions. I think we're all, I'm as guilty as anyone else, like, here's a list of things you need to do. But, what we need to do is out there. It's just, how do we persuade the government that they really have to do it?
Just so on that point of how do you persuade the government, I guess that's the thing that often I find in my work, and people would ask me is like, you found all these things, how do we get change? Like, do you feel like we know any more about that? Basically, we're in a government-induced scandal, frankly. If the government hadn't tried to get rid of the standards off, like, you couldn't write it in some respects. If the government hadn't tried to unilaterally take apart and rip down the standards process, we wouldn't be having this conversation the way we are. But they did. So how do we get a government like that? And even taking your point about it not being partisan, but how do we get a government like that to act?
It's a really important point, because also, actually, I wanted to say, all this stuff about Cox was actually pretty much in the public domain beforehand, but it's because of what the government did that it's become, people don't care about it. So, and I think that's really important to remember, because it feels like the government are now trying to shift the blame onto MPs, and MPs are the problem, not their behaviour, and not the fact that, the Prime Minister doesn't have to, if he's a minister, he doesn't have to declare the amount he gets in free holidays, but if he was an MP, he would. It's extraordinary that the more powerful you are, the less accountable you are, and the less transparent you have to be. But sorry, that's a kind of aside to your question of how do we persuade a government of this. I mean, I thought it's really fascinating that the hashtag after it happened was decent Tories, and that was kind of trending on Twitter for a while. And there were, that 13, it was a little bit like, when there was the Brexit rebellion, and they were turned into the kind of Star Wars, heroes. I mean, but we talked to some of those MPs, and it's really difficult because, Boris is all powerful. And our system is such that if you have a parliamentary majority, you are pretty much king. You get to rule on the minister's standards. You can ram through legislation. So, I mean, it's difficult, but I think we have to chip away at this, really this has got to be something we've got to change. And I think it helped all those people who wrote to their MPs after it happened and said, this is disgusting. It does. That stuff really matters, and it does work.
Sorry, yeah, just a quick plug actually there for Open Democracy's work. We've got a new tool that allows you to write to your MP, and thousands of our readers did. And actually, really interestingly, a number of them came back. And I agree about this point about it, pulling it away from making a party political. Like, a number of Conservative MPs came back. One expressed like what, saying basically, what are you talking about? There's nothing to see here. But actually, a number of them came with a bit of ashen facedness and said, look, I'm sorry about this. And I think it is really important to connect people with their MPs and for MPs to see that this is something that they care about. Prem, in your own experience, like, I feel like this might be something you would say of yourself. You're in the belly of the beast. You're in the House of Lords. You're not you're someone who's not a big fan of the House of Lords. So how do you feel change? How would you like to see change? And what do you think change is what change is possible, do you think, from within the architecture of government?
I think first, we've got to remember the kind of scandals we are talking about now are not new. We remember in the past MPs getting cash for questions and so on. But I think what we need to do is make sure that no political party at Westminster has a majority. Because when they have a huge majority in a place like House of Commons, they basically ride roughshod over everything else, change the rules to suit themselves. So we really need to change our voting system, have a form of PR, which means that basically governments can be overridden by Parliament. For example, at the moment, if a large number of MPs oppose a particular government's policy, they don't really get anywhere because the government has a built-in majority. So that, I think, needs to be the starting point. Sue earlier referred to the rules of disclosure of the members' interests. They are pitiful. If I may just drop one or two names and give examples. Some time ago, I was asked by media outlets to look at how much money Jacob Rees-Mogg makes out of his various business dealings. It is impossible to find out because firstly, the accounts of various companies, which take you to Caymans and other places, don't really give you the full information. Secondly, parliamentary rules say, just tell us of businesses where you have more than 15% holding, that don't say how much money you actually make. And of course, lots of money is being made that is not being disclosed, so people can't really find out and ask any appropriate questions about this. So I think the issue about the political donations also has to be dealt with. And in some ways, the word donations is a misnomer because the rich people and corporations don't donate, they invest. They want a return. The return is either friendly laws or a regulatory system, which is pretty toothless. And you have these kind of revolving doors as well, where a politician ends up working for some of these giant corporations, which in their previous life they're supposed to have regulated. And you don't just get a job overnight with a company, on that basis. And also, Oliver referred to tax havens, which are formerly called crown dependencies and Britain's overseas territories. They are basically a blot on the global landscape. What they are offering is abuses, whether it is regulatory abuse, tax abuse, and they are offering opacity. There is nothing else to offer. They are not known for any advances in science, engineering, mathematics, medicine, or anything else that improves the quality of life. And it is within Britain's power to improve the governance of those places, but it does not do so. But it is not just these tax havens. When you look at home as well, we recently debated things about Companies House. Look, anybody from anywhere in the world can form a company in the UK, absolutely no check on the authenticity of their name, address, anything. And the government is just complaining that 27 billion pound worth of COVID loans may be fraudulent, and they want to catch these people. Absolutely no chance. Even if somebody is genuine and lives in Latvia, they can't deal with them. And even at home, people may well have given false name and addresses. So this idea about secrecy not just applies at the political institutions level, it filters down to all the other layers too, about formation of companies, company accounts. Companies publish them. They're incredibly opaque. I can't make head or tail of many companies' accounts, and I've been an accountant for 50 years plus. And there's no inclination to change. So we have different levels of rot really, and they all need addressing. But let us make a start with the political system and the institutions of politics really.
Thank you very much, Prem. And I could see Oliver Bullough nodding a lot there, especially when he talked about Companies House. I used to live in North Finchley, around the corner from a brass plaque that had 36,000 companies registered to it. They were all doing business simultaneously, I'm sure. Very, very busy building. It was like one office actually. And I guess, Oliver, it kind of begs that question about the different types of corruption, as Prem was talking about, I think, and how they're linked together. One thing that really struck me is that kind of thinking about this relationship between the political corruption in British political life and Britain's role as a kind of facilitator for global corruption and internationally. And where do you think that sits? And do you think these two things, how do you feel that those two things kind of sit together?
It's really interesting. I read today, there was a piece in the FT Weekend magazine, which I read today on their website, which I really recommend to everyone if you can read it. It's about the role of hereditary lords in the House of Lords, who are elected to the House of Lords by other hereditary lords, which it's a system that no one would invent. And it's kind of amazing that anyone did. But what I found particularly interesting about it is why the hereditary lords remaining in the House of Lords was supposed to be a stopgap when we were on the way to an elected House of Lords. But of course, we never got an elected House of Lords. And the reason is that the House of Commons didn't want a chamber which could challenge it, essentially, that would have equal legitimacy to the House of Commons. And I think this is the problem, that we have an executive, a prime minister, who is just tremendously powerful. The cabinet is much larger than it was maybe in the 1950s or 60s, so it isn't a place for discussion anymore. We have this ability to pack the House of Lords. We have a Baron of Siberia now you know, a man who's only a British citizen because his dad used to be KGB station chief, which is like, I mean, it is something that you wouldn't invent. It's so insane. You know, we have an extraordinarily underfunded law enforcement system in the National Crime Agency and the Serious Fraud Office. We have a fragmented and very inefficient anti-money laundering system. We repeat all across the board. The government and the sort of business elite is just not challenged, and in fact, they take being challenged, as we saw with the Owen Paterson case, as a sort of, you know, as a real liberty being taken by people who should just get out of the way. And I think that what we need to recognise is that being challenged is a good thing. I mean, Sue said earlier that we don't want the talk about corruption to be politicised, which I completely agree. There shouldn't be a corrupt Tories type thing. But I think we do want it to be politicised in the sense that it needs to be part of a political process whereby people challenging each other can bring out cases of corruption, and it can be exposed via the political process rather than via journalism or whatever. There needs to be someone on the front line who isn't a journalist. So I suppose I have this dream. My pop references tend to be extremely nerdy, and I have this dream that, you know, a candidate for Prime Minister next time round could take on the role of Frodo and offer to take the ring of power that the Prime Minister has and throw it at the volcano and cast all this power that the Prime Minister has aside and just say, no, we're not going to have that anymore. I'm going to give away the patronage right. I'm not going to be able to appoint the House of Lords anymore. I'm not going to be able to control who runs the BBC. All these things will be given away, and there will be independent systems to select them. And the Prime Minister will then be challenged properly and will no longer, you know, take it as a personal affront if the BBC happens to remark that he spent 600 quid on wallpaper or whatever it is. So that's what I think we need. And you know, and that applies in the British Virgin Islands and Gibraltar and everywhere, all across what's left of the British Empire. We have these very centralised systems with very few balances and checks that we desperately need. So I would like to see that. I mean, I think that House of Lords reform is very overdue, and that would be a good place to start. But it's just the beginning. You know, we're all of our independent agencies are you know, running on fumes really, and they need to be properly resourced and properly supported.
Prem, do you want to come in on that? House of Lords feels like a, you know, Oliver's reference to House of Lords feels like a moment, you know, what do you think about reforming, just not just the House of Lords, but more generally as well? You know, you're a lot of experience in accounting, like these kind of independent bodies, these sort of independent oversight, like what would that look like? What would practical change look like?
I think depends at the level you're looking at. Certainly I went in the House of Lords hoping that within my lifetime, I would be able to vote it out of existence. But that opportunity may not come because the Labour leader himself is now reluctant to reform the House of Lords. But I think there is also an issue: on what basis would you elect it? The last thing we want is the same party to have a huge majority in the Commons and then also in the Lords. So maybe there is some basis to think about whether every member of the second chamber needs to be independent. Maybe there is some regional basis. But, you know, so there is a huge danger that if you really get that. But if you look on the register of members' interest, whether it is for Commons or the Lords, you will find there are so many people on the payroll of big corporations. And I cringe every time I hear somebody say, congratulates the minister that they took care of so-and-so industry. I don't hear people congratulate anybody about somebody's taken care of the homeless people or hungry people or people who are poor or pensioners who may be dying of cold, but they do get congratulated because they're taken care of some kind of industry. I think we do have to address the issue about the party funding. And a lot of people say, let us ban. I don't want to ban anything. If anything, I would say absolutely no restriction of making any political contribution to any political party. Anyone from anywhere in the world could do it, but there are some provisos. Proviso is that no political party receives a penny of that. All of that can go in what I would say is a foundation for democracy. And then that distributes it on the basis of the members they got or the share of the votes they got. Because the difficulty is if you ban it, I haven't got time to actually refer to the cases. I have investigated some for the media in yesteryears. People find a way of bypassing it, okay? And that then becomes very difficult to police. So I will do the same with the MPs' jobs and say, look, you can do as much consultancy as you like, because if you want to ban it, they would say, oh my God, this helps me to be a better MP and be in touch with what is going on. So I would say, you go and do as much consultancy as you want, but we are paying you £82,000 a year to do a full-time job. You don't get a penny of that consultancy. That will go into this foundation, actually then be distributed. At that point, you will find all these people who they say are donors to political parties, they would mostly vanish. MPs probably will not do this consultancy. And then we can get back to real question about how do we fund political parties? Should we really fund them through the state? For example, if each of us paid £1 a year, that could probably free all the political parties from these clutches. But on the other hand, if you jumped straight to state funding of the political parties, you will find all these other people be, misleading the people, misleading the debate. So my solution is, one which I really have just outlined, that would be a way forward of freeing our political system from the clutches of big money. And that should really apply to, the Lords is a very interesting issue because members don't really get paid. They get an allowance, but nevertheless, there are these links with corporate interests. And I think they need to be weakened, they need to be severed, or they need to be certainly more visible. And at the moment, they are not. And because the rules of disclosure are not very good at all.
So I just wanted to bring you in on this. You mentioned the Boardman review, and I think just to pick up on some of the points Prem made, it feels like a long time ago, but the David Cameron Greensill scandal was only 6 months ago. And, I know it is honestly, it was. So you've check your diaries. And, at that point, you've got a lobby, we have a lobbying register that frankly doesn't work. It misses, I think, on some accounts, misses 96% of lobbying. It certainly missed David Cameron's. In the wake of that, there was PACAC inquiry, Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs inquiry, the Boardman review, a series of measures and questions in Parliament. And, it does feel like that's run into the sand. And I guess how, it's kind of going back to that question again of what measures would be possible, but what would start to try to bring out, and I think as what Prem seems to be saying is the sunlight of transparency. I see someone on the thread as well talking about how hard it is to find things like register of interest, which is easy to find if you're a journalist or something, but if you're a member of the public. And so I'm just wondering, Sue, where do you, how would this be possible? How would this, making these sort of changes that Prem is talking about, happen?
Yeah, that's pretty urgent, I would say. I think the Committee on Standards and Public Life as well said, central register, searchable, updated monthly, everything, including electronic communications, a far greater range of people who are being lobbied, not dissimilar to Boardman. There's lots of overlap between their recommendations on that. So come on, let's get on with it, and I think that's the thing, is that we need to be saying to the government, when are you going to do this? This is what you've been told to do. When are you going to do this? But I think there's much greater transparency we need. But we also do need, I want to pick up on something Oliver said, we desperately need more enforcement. And I think I always come back to this Sarkozy, question. In the UK, could a prime minister who broke the law actually be investigated independently by the police and investigated? And the bottom line is, when there was last a cash for honours scandal, the Met Police ran into the sand. They were blocked. They couldn't get the information. There are plenty of cases where, the police, they can't just go and break down the doors of government ministries and say, hand us the documents, which is what you've seen it in Germany. We saw the police go and break down the Ministry of Finance's doors with the Wirecard thing. In Austria, we've seen a prime minister, being, and I just don't think, it could be that, our politicians are all so, perfect and abiding by, the rules. It could be the rules are rubbish themselves, but we just don't have an independent police force. And I think I just want to tell you, something. There is no funding in this country for police enforcement of domestic corruption. There is no one body that is meant to do it, and there is no reporting line. And I think that really speaks to the incredible complacency that there is, that, corruption is not, it's just not British, and it's not something we do. But I'm slightly aware as well, Pete, that we moved away from your original question, which is about how it intersects with the dirty money thing. But I think they're also, they're part of the same thing, aren't they? The reason it's making your wealthy donors lords, which is an extraordinary thing that the Prime Minister still has that power to just do that. It's wealthy donors, whether they are foreign donors. I mean, the reason why all these, Russian oligarchs are presumably making such donations to the Conservative Party is because they are the party in power and they want them in their pocket, right? So I think there is a incredible overlap with the dirty money stuff.
I wanted to bring in, there's a question there it was submitted by Graham Spears, and I headed this asking about, should the Serious Fraud Office be investigating COVID contracts? And I guess I almost wanted to expand that, Oliver, to ask about, should the Serious Fraud Office be investigating a lot of the things that we are seeing in both our political life, but also kind of aspects of our business life? This world of dirty money that Sue describes, this kind of nexus of the City of London that is so intricately linked to our politics. The City of London and British politics are intricately linked, and it feels as if we can't separate these two things out, and actually we need to think about all of them.
I mean, I think it's very difficult to understand how poorly funded these organisations are, which is another way of saying how little they've been a political priority for the longest time. The saying that our enforcement agencies are under-resourced is just another way of saying that the politicians don't care about them. The Serious Fraud Office, it does its best, but it's got a couple of dozen people. And if you talk to, people at the DOJ kleptocracy unit, which Americans say is underfunded, they talk about it like you talk about a baby brother. They say, the SFO is quite sweet. They have a go, don't they? It's currently tied up with the the Kazakh trio, the Eurasian Natural Resources Company, and it probably will be for quite a long time. What we need to be looking at is the National Crime Agency. It was set up to be Britain's FBI, but as we know from the Intelligence and Security Committee's Russia report, it can't take on oligarchs because it doesn't have the budget. It tried to take on the first daughter of Kazakhstan in a unexplained wealth order and spectacularly failed, got a bloody nose, which appears to have put a stop to new unexplained wealth orders. What we desperately need, I think Liz David Barrett was saying this the other day on Newsnight, is a proper economic crime police force. We have the City of London Police that has a sort of supposedly lead role in tackling fraud, but it isn't sufficiently resourced to go and tackle fraud all over the place. We have Action Fraud, which is a kind of central database for reporting fraud, but there are so many reports that the police officers that run it can't even read all the reports that come in. I think we need to bear in mind that we're not just talking about illicit financial flows from kleptocrats here. We're also talking about an epidemic of fraud. The most common crime reported to the authorities in this country is fraud, and these are cases of people, often vulnerable older people, pensioners, losing £30,000, £40,000, the kind of sums of money that the police just aren't interested in, but are life-changing. That is a kind of money, leaving aside the humiliation of being defrauded, that is ruining your life. That's your life savings gone, and there is no prospect of them being recovered. So it isn't just a question of the top end that corruption isn't being investigated, or kleptocracy isn't being investigated, or money laundering isn't being stopped, all of which are true. But also, fraud, which is huge and growing all the time. I mean, the COVID frauds are well known, but it was a massive problem beforehand. Are also being under investigated. There is an across the board failure of regulation and enforcement that I genuinely don't understand why that doesn't get political traction, why parties don't make more of it, why it doesn't get more presence in the media. And I really hope that this week will be the start of a process where we start to take these issues much more seriously, because it is that the failure is extraordinary. And I'd just say, I think in a sign of how seriously the government is taking this issue, it is remarkable that John Whittingdale MP, the man who was going to be put in charge of the abortive standards regulator that didn't happen, I'm sure a perfectly nice chap. I've spoken to him a couple of times. He's very charming, but he's also a man who accepted £3,000 from Vladimir Putin's favorite Ukrainian oligarch to fly to Vienna and back in order to attend a conference set up by that oligarch. Now, this is not a man with the best will in the world who appears to appreciate the dangers posed to this country by illicit finance. And I think that's probably true of our whole establishment, to be honest. There is still a willingness to take money. I mean, bearing in mind that the government sold that same oligarch Dimitri Firtash a tube station for £53 million. I mean, it is, we are in a situation where people take the money first and ask questions second, if at all.
Sue, as someone at Spotlight Corruption who's really trying to put these stuff, trying to quite literally shine a spotlight on corruption, put it onto the political agenda, what do you find, what do you find is the barriers to doing that? Like as Oliver said, because in some ways this should be a no-brainer. It should be something that's really easy for politicians to go and say, look, there's money to be made here, frankly, in terms of clamping down on corruption. The amount of money it costs, the registering companies doesn't bring any money into the British economy. It's a tiny, a couple of people make a living as company registrars, but it's sucking so much money out. Why? What are the barriers, do you think, to action?
So I think a key one is something that Boris said a couple of weeks ago at an investment conference. He said, we welcome every pound to this country. And I think it kind of says it all, frankly, which is that there is no discernment. So there's a whole kind of language about how great we are at tackling money laundering and how we are the best in the world at doing it. But then there are these failures of political will, as Oliver says, about really stumping up, the resources to fund the law enforcement agencies. And I think that one of the reasons is, the politics is also so driven by a focus group culture, and the only thing that people care about is the NHS. So unless we could make a really good case that economic crime is devastating to the NHS, we're always going to face an uphill battle because it's not something, and which is where fraud is really important, because actually so many people have been affected by fraud, and it really is really damaging to people's savings, and but even that doesn't seem to be enough for the Treasury to go like, right, we're going to stump up. Here's what we're going to stump up. We're going to tackle this. But I would like to add one other factor, which is actually about political interference. Like the directors of the Serious Fraud Office, past and present, have talked about having to operate in an environment where they've never experienced this, where and there's a case that was in court recently where the CEO, the company was fined and pleaded guilty. The CEO was nowhere to be seen, and he happens to be a Tory donor. We see another case, in a dirty money case, where a Tory donor is not on the charge sheet, but he's deeply implicated in this case. So there's this kind of intersection actually between Tory donors and a lack of enforcement that is really, really worrying.
Prem, I just wanted to bring you in on this as well, just to ask you a bit about, almost with your accountant hat on, less your peer of the realm hat on, which is, how can we start to address the UK's role as basically the money laundering and dirty money capital of the world? Like, what practical steps could we tackle? Because it feels to me like there is a narrative moment, to go back to this idea of narrative, because of the political corruption that we're talking about, to talk about this other type of corruption, which, as we described, is very linked to it as well. But it feels like there could be a moment to put some of those kind of issues that Oliver and Sue mentioned front and center, these issues around, around money laundering and illicit finance.
Well, there is no silver bullet, but certainly sunlight is a great thing. But I think we also need appropriate institutional structure. So if I may give you one or two examples, the Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner prosecuted some corrupt bankers from HBOS because FCA would not do it. Many other institutions would not do it. At the end, he spent £7 million of his police budget, and he successfully prosecuted some HBOS bankers. They were convicted and sent to prison, but the government did not give him a single penny towards the cost. When the FCA eventually, after the conviction, levied a fine on Lloyds Bank, all the money went to the Treasury. So that means no police force has any economic incentive whatsoever to deal with wrongdoers because their budget is eroded and there are obviously other demands. We don't have an integrated police force. So we may have a police force dealing with, say, Essex or London. You might find company A's committed some crime. It involves individuals, say, from Scotland, Leeds, other places. They are not really integrated. And that is a deliberate political decision. So that is sort of one example. Let's take another one where we don't actually hear that corrupt practices actually have been covered up. And I'll refer to a real example, which I've documented in my parliamentary debates, and that relates to HSBC. HSBC in 2012 were fined $1.9 billion in the US for facilitating money laundering. Now, HSBC, on the face of it, entered a deferred prosecution agreement and got off the hook. But that did not satisfy another US House of Representatives committee. It decided to investigate how it come that a bank faced the biggest ever fine, but is actually not prosecuted. And we have to remember HSBC is registered in the UK, and at that time it was subject to regulation first by the Bank of England and then by the Financial Services Authority. So unknown to anybody else, without any public statement, the then Chancellor, George Osborne, the Governor of the Bank of England, and the FSA secretly corresponded with US authorities asking them to go easy on HSBC because the bank is too big to jail or too big to fail, which raises fundamental questions. If governments are protecting organizations which in writing admitted that they've been engaged in, and I quote, criminal conduct, how do you reform the financial system? How do you change the banking regulation? How do you call governments to account? How do you call regulators to account? And that is not the only example. Bank of Credit Commerce International, formally closed down in July 1991. To this day, there has been no independent investigation into the biggest banking fraud of 20th century. After 5.5 years of litigation, I obtained a document which is supposedly secret, still not publicly released, but I have put it on the website. Anyone can go on Google, put the name, the Sandstorm Report, can see it. Now, this document, which the government suppressed, it shows that BCCI was looted by individuals connected with Al-Qaeda, Saudi intelligence, royal families in the Middle East, gun smugglers, you name it, all the low life is actually there. But government to this day won't even release the document which they've given me, which I put out myself in the public domain. Again, you ask yourself the question, do the governments actually value the public's right to know? Do they really want to reform the financial system? You can't reform it in this way by simply saying, if there is a stench, we will just cover it up, which is basically kind of a British approach. If there is a scandal, we will hush it up, as they try to do with the MPs, making a lot of money on the side. Until the stench gets so strong, then they might tweak at the edges. What we need are, a lot of civil society organizations like yours and others, to be constantly at it. So in Parliament, the minister never apologized for this cover-up, made no statement as to why they made it, why BCCI documents are still secret, what they did at HSBC, no remorse, no shame. And the more interesting thing is, how many other peers who are connected with big business stood up and said that there are circumstances when it is in the national interest for the governments to cover these things up. I can think of no national and no public reason, nothing in the national interest that demands that you cover up corruption, money laundering, illicit financial flows, because they are damaging each and every one of us. So that is the kind of a political culture. It is not just this government, it has gone on and on and on. And I think really maybe the crunch point is coming. So all of us really need to push for fundamental institutional reforms. It is the institutions, which are facilitating these corrupt practices, really.
Thank you very much for that, Prem. And yeah, there's a hell of a lot to unpack in that. I'm kind of tempted, we don't have that much time left, but there's one of the questions that came in from Alice Donnellan, which I think it feels like a question that might be quite useful to think about briefly, is what areas, roles, skills should recent graduates like myself be prioritising to help tackle corruption in the coming decades? And I think it's a very, we all grow up into worlds, into systems, and we kind of find ourselves in them. How could a young person, Oliver, what would you say? What are the kind of roles and skills we should be engendering in young people to try and tackle some of this corruption?
It's funny, I think as journalists, we have a bit of a tendency to think, well, we just need more journalists, right? If all you've got is a hammer, then every nail, or whichever way around it is. But I think actually probably the best journalist at exposing this stuff and who has been working at it the longest is probably Richard Brooks at Private Eye. He came into it from working as a tax inspector. And because of his I think unique background for a journalist, he has these skills and insights that no one else has. I would also say that big fan of Private Eye. I would also say that probably the best coverage of COVID was MD in Private Eye, who is a medical doctor, obviously, as the name suggests. So I would say obviously journalists are great. We're all marvelous, but we need honest lawyers. We need honest accountants. We need people who genuinely understand what's happening, because at the end of the day, journalists are sort of a bit dilettantes, really. We look from outside and we try and understand, but at the end of the day, we don't really know. So people who can go inside, you just have to look at the good work that Jolyon Morm is doing in terms of exposing the COVID contracts. He's able to do that because he's a barrister and he came at it from the tax bar, and he's very very experienced and gifted at exposing those kind of issues. So I would say that become an expert in something, in something connected to corruption. Unfortunately, there are many parts of that, but I would say, the law and accountancy are the two main ones. And then, get the skills, get the ability to speak the language of corruption, and then rip into it, take it apart, because that's what's really needed. We need, some really skilled foot soldiers. Of course, the risk is that you're going to get paid so much and you're going to enjoy yourself so much buying Maseratis and going on holiday in Dubai all the time that you'll end up being one of the bad guys. But then look on the bright side, you'll be loaded.
So what do you think about
that? Don't do the Maserati bit. Actually, the thing I was thinking is what we really need is some really good, honest politicians. And that we need more of those. And the one thing that worries me about this crisis is it just makes everyone switch off to politics and think, I would never go there, and I think that's really problematic. But in fact, to become a good politician, you need to have done something, some of the things that Oliver says, which is be kind of, get really good at something that, you bring a skill to politics with. So, I think that risk, though, of them, staying, I've seen a lot of that, people going into the law and never leaving, because the bottom line is, a newly qualified lawyer gets 150,000, and the director of the SFO, the top salary in the Serious Fraud Office is 200,000. I think that says it all. You will never get, more than about 50-60,000 in the Serious Fraud Office. So I think there are some real debates around that to be had. But don't give up. There's lots to be done. There is a huge amount to be done.
Prem, I'll give you the last word on how to avoid being like you and ending up in the House of Lords.
I have no idea. Just to sort of let people know, I was not initially keen at all to go to the House of Lords. I said when I was nominated by Jeremy Corbyn, I said I'll go on a number of conditions. One, that I can vote the place out of existence. Okay, that was acceptable. And the other thing I was really concerned about, what I initially didn't want to go, but it was put to me, look, you do need to make some competing discourses voluble inside these institutions. And therefore, in a sense, why don't you go? You can talk about a whole range of things. So I was eventually persuaded on that basis. But I think, we talk about democracy. If you think about it, do we really have a great deal of democracy? Just putting a cross on a piece of paper every 4 or 5 years and replacing the guard team A with guard team A1 or B, to me, that doesn't really appear to be much to do with democracy. We need to have this thing called democracy in every walk of life. We have a freedom of information law, which is incredibly poor, but we don't even have anything equivalent of that applicable to large corporations who in many ways govern our life more than elected governments. These corporations are deciding the quality, they control kind of what we eat, what we drink, the news we consume. They have control of our savings, pensions. But at the end of the day, what do we actually know about them? And that makes it almost impossible to call them to account. So we really need, if you like, to challenge corporate power, because that is what lies behind a lot of these scandals. So a lot of focus has been on the demand for bribes and consultancy fees and corruption, but there is a supply side, and the supply side is usually in big business. And we haven't really had much discussion about what to do with the power of big business. And that, I think, is really, to my mind, will be a defining feature of the 21st century. Either we can have strong corporations or democracy, but we can't have both because the two don't go together. And that is what we are witnessing, in the crisis we are looking at now.
Thank you very, very much for that, Prem. And I feels like a kind of fitting way to close this, talking about open democracy, a place which really is all about trying to hold power to account. So, in some ways you did a better job for me as a summation than I could have done for myself, Prem. So thank you very much for that. But completely, I think this is exactly, and I think this conversation has shown is that there is so much within this topic. There's so much around the corruption takes all these different forms. I think trying to understand the power of corporate in the corporate world within our politics and our democracy, I think, is a huge part of it. It's a big part of what we do here at Open Democracy. And as part of that, I just want to say thanks for everybody for joining this debate. Thanks to our fantastic panelists, Oliver, Sue and Prem. And thanks to everybody who contributed their questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them. To be honest, there was just so many questions there, we couldn't get to all of them. I think this is a discussion that could have ran and ran. It could have ran longer than most House of Commons debates. So thank you very much. Just before you go, just we do have a weekly debate on Open Democracy, or almost weekly anyway, and you can check our website and social media for details on opendemocracy.net/n/live discussions. And one final thing as well is Open Democracy relies on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism, the kind of things that Open Democracy has been doing in recent weeks and months and in many ways years, exposing corruption and many other aspects of malfeasance in public life, please do consider supporting Open Democracy. And thank you all again for joining. And I guess we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.